In this lesson, we're going to show you how Appian and Blue Prism work together through an example use case on invoice processing. The objective is to process invoices and insert data from each invoice into a legacy accounts payable system. The system doesn't have any APIs, so without Blue Prism's robots, we'd have to build integration points. In our example, Blue Prism robots receive invoices through email attachments. The robots download each attachment and parse data from the attachment to compare it to data from purchase orders. The expectation is that the data match. The number of items ordered, total cost, etc. These should be the same in the invoice as in the purchase order. As long as the data matches, Blue Prism can process the invoice. However, if the data doesn't match, it's a problem. In our example, there's a mismatch in data between the purchase order and invoice. This is what we call an exception to the process. These exceptions must be managed by humans, and that's where Appian comes in. As in most automated processes, there are a few different reasons humans may need to get involved with invoice processing. The first is exceptions, which includes our example. This is when the data can't be validated or is missing. The second is approval, which in our case is when the total invoice amount reaches a threshold and has to be approved or authorized by the finance department. The third is process oversight, which happens when users analyze reports that show us data across invoice processing in an effort to improve the process. When the exception is triggered, Appian uses data it receives from Blue Prism to determine which group of users should be assigned a task. Data includes the process that triggered the exception and the priority of the issue. Once the exception is routed, the assigned users are notified and they can view the task in Appian. Once they complete the task, Appian runs a second check on the data from each invoice to determine if it needs approval. This determination is based on a business rule that checks the total cost of the invoice. If it meets a threshold, a second task is issued. Part of human involvement is monitoring the process. Appian can aggregate all of the data from Blue Prism along with any data generated in Appian to create reports. These reports provide transparency into our automation events and trends. Now let's see what the process actually looks like for users. First, we've created a process in Blue Prism that downloads the invoice from an email and parses the data from the invoice to compare it to purchase orders. When we encounter an exception, the process makes a call to an Appian web API that's set up to receive the data from Blue Prism and use it to start an Appian process. The Appian process uses data from the invoice and the exception to generate a task and route it to the appropriate user or group of users to address. Tasks automatically create a notification for the user or group assigned. The notification can be viewed on mobile devices with the Appian app or in an email. When anyone assigned the task logs into Appian, they'll see the task in their queue. Everything in this task list is configurable. You can use filters to search for and access tasks quickly and identify each task using specific data, like when the task was received, its deadline, or its priority. After you click on a task, you have to accept it to work on it, which prevents other users from working on it at the same time. You can see the data that we've received from Blue Prism in a modern, engaging, and fully configurable interface. In this case, we've designed all the fields to be editable where there may be a discrepancy in the data. For example, you can modify the shipping address, change the quantity of an existing item, or even add an additional item if one's missing. You can even use the invoice to verify that the data is accurate. It looks like the exception triggered as a result of a missing PO number. In this case, I can tab over to Vendors, find the vendor on the invoice, and find the matching PO number. What we're seeing now is what we call a record. Appian allows us to query and display related data for any object in a single integrated place, even if the data is stored in external systems. A record doesn't get assigned to a user like a task. Instead, it's accessible anytime, by anyone who has privileges to it. Like a task, the interface is completely configurable. We can even start new processes from the record in order to act on the data that we're seeing here. Back on our task, we can resolve the exception by updating the PO number and submitting the task. Appian then routes the data through some additional business logic to determine if the task needs approval. If it does, Appian triggers a second task. In this one, you can see a side-by-side comparison of the invoice and the purchase order. If you want to focus on a particular set of data, you can filter it using a link. Notice none of the data is editable here, since my responsibility is to approve or reject the task, not update the data. We always want to reduce exceptions, but it's hard to know where there are issues without more transparency into the process. The first set of reports we're going to look at provides us insight into Blue Prism's processes and robots. This report is actually a real live report that Appian created for our Blue Prism users. You can download the report as part of the Blue Prism reference app and configure it to work using instructions we provide. We'll talk more about the reference app later. As you can see, this report shows us cumulative analytics across our Blue Prism environment. Here we can see we have 43 total Blue Prism processes, 52 supporting objects, 3 resources or robots, and 14 total sessions. Altogether, the resources have saved us about 1,500 man-hours. We can also see across our processes the total number of transactions and exceptions, which are further categorized by the type of transaction. Or we can choose to see transactions categorized by process instead. You can drill down into specific Blue Prism processes and see details like the number of exceptions and executed tasks. Lastly, we can see which processes are utilizing the most resources to assist with load balancing and resource planning in the future. The second set of reports are specific to our invoice management process. Here, we can first see some high-level statistics to get an idea of the amount of processing that's taking place. Below, we can view and filter data for individual invoices. Next, we can see aggregate data across invoices to get a better idea of how long they take to process and our current active count. Further, we can see the total number of invoices processed by robots versus humans and a breakdown by month for the last year. Lastly, we can combine our automation data with business data that's collected from the same process to identify which departments spend the most money as well as which vendors do. Now that you've seen what this process looks like to our end users, let's go behind the scenes and see what some of the supporting Appian objects look like for the people that build and configure them, our designers.